Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our Worst Map Ever series with the Maginot Line map. And as a little piece of trivia before we get started, the Maginot Line map was actually introduced with the Law Resistance update that added the French tech tree, so that coincided pretty nicely. Now, Maginot Line actually has a total of 14 different variants. However, literally half of them are snow maps, as Maginot Line was one of the first maps in the game to get a snow remake alongside maps like Spheres 13. Maginot Line is also one of the first maps we've had in this series that actually restricts or expands the amount of play area that you can play in. And this also brings up a rather interesting point. While it may on the surface look like there are two Maginot Lines, a small and a large, there are actually three: a small, a large, and a huge. You can slightly see the difference between the large map and the huge map if you look closely. It does expand the play area, although mostly in the top, bottom, and right hand side. Now, with Maginot Line having so many snow variants, it's probably a good time to chat about snow maps in general. Now, I fully understand that some individuals do have trouble with snow maps just because of monitor settings or things of that nature. Personally, I don't really have that issue, so I can't speak to it. However, I do myself actually like the snow maps more than normal, all things considered. Part of the reason is the snow provides higher contrast, so it's easier to see enemies, but another really important feature, at least for me personally, is that it makes it much easier to see aircraft, because aircraft have contrails at any altitude, whereas on a normal map they only have contrails out to about 5 or 6 kilometers in the air. So an aircraft in a normal map has to be very high up for you to see a contrail, whereas you see basically contrails on everything on snow maps. So in general, the improved visibility, at least for me, is a nice quality of life change, and I don't personally have any monitor issues, although I have heard of some people having them. With that being said, Maginot is not significantly affected by line of sight changes when you go into a snow map. However, there are definitely some maps that are negatively affected by it, because it turns out when you go from full-on trees into trees that have no leaves on them, parts of line of sight get opened that would normally be largely inaccessible unless you have something like thermal imaging. So if we do end up doing a snow map that actually does have a difference in terms of viable lines of sight for various types of vehicles, I will bring it up, but Maginot Line is sparse enough in terms of tree lines that it doesn't meaningfully affect the lines of sight at all. Now, this is where we also get to a fun little eccentricity on the Maginot map, because here are the huge maps for Maginot, and you will notice every last one of them is a single capture map. And this one really confuses me. Why would you have the fewest objectives on the largest possible map? It makes very little sense and seems like it might be a designer oversight. Another slightly noteworthy feature is that Maginot Line actually has two different variants of 2-cap maps. One is a smaller version and one is a larger version, and we'll go into those right now. The reason I'm going to this right away is basically because the capture points on the 2-cap in Maginot are not used by any other game mode, so you're only ever going to use them in the 2-cap game mode. On top of that, they're in very similar positions, just ever so slightly further apart from one another. And one thing that I can say pretty definitively is that while I will generally advise you to never go for capture points on the 2-cap maps, if you are from the north spawn, the south spawn's capture point is actually pretty accessible and remarkably defendable in both variants. The opposite, however, is not true. If you're in the south spawn, the north spawn's capture point is obnoxiously exposed by comparison. In fact, both of them are. So in general, this is one of those few 2-cap maps where one side actually does have a very minor advantage. But I would stress minor. It is still quite difficult to take either of these capture points while the enemy team is still alive and still respawning. Now, briefly going over the various capture points, the B capture point is fairly static across game modes that use that area. It is in the middle of the town. The B capture point, I will say, is actually noticeably bigger on some modes than it is on others, but on the whole it is in basically the same position. The B capture point is noticeably easier to get into from the north spawn than it is from the south spawn, simply because you have a lot more lowland and a lot more cover, whereas the south spawn often has to go up or around the hill in the middle of the map, which can leave them somewhat exposed. That being said, once you get onto the capture point itself, the capture point is relatively well covered and also has access to convenient sightlines covering a lot of different areas of the map. So the B capture point is not a bad destination if you're looking for a capture point to go for. Going over to the A capture points, you have both the capture point that is deeper in the city and the capture point that is a little bit further out. Both of these are effectively just as accessible from either spawn. However, I will note that if you get the A spawn on the larger map that is further out, once the enemy has secured A, it can be very difficult to approach because you have a built-up area that you have to go near where the enemy can just use the third-person camera to see over hills or around walls and snipe you. Whereas if you get the smaller version of Maginot, the A cap tends to be a lot more accessible and there are a lot more routes to sneak up on it without necessarily exposing yourself to hostile fire. The C capture point, however, is a bit of an island. While there is definitely cover on both versions of the C capture map available, there's not a lot of great ways onto it, and once you get onto it, there aren't a lot of great ways off of it. The south spawn, in my opinion, has the best routes off of it just because the north spawn has a hill in front of it, so they often can't see down far enough to shoot you without exposing themselves. However, getting to it is going to be the challenge because you're overwatched by a lot of positions. The north spawn has a slightly easier time getting off of the point, but has a much harder time getting onto it because they have to go all the way down a big hill. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I don't find the C point is all that accessible, and you will often find, even pretty late in the map, that it still remains unclaimed, or one team rushes for it early and just keeps it the entire map. Now, generally speaking, the movement lanes on Maginot are pretty straightforward. There are movement lanes going from either spawn to either capture point. However, there is a small eccentricity in terms of the A capture point. On large Maginot, it's a bit of a lottery as to whether teams swing wide to a right-hand flank or try to go through the city to get to A, whereas on small Maginot, teams mostly just go straight to A and don't try to wrap around anywhere near as much. So it is important to keep this in mind depending on what variant of the map you're on. Of course, this is where we get to the discussion on power positions, and Maginot has a fairly dominant power position in the hill immediately south of B. This hill overlooks a lot of movement lanes and a lot of other power positions in and around the C point and both spawns. So in effect, controlling this can allow you to control a large area of the map. Additionally, from this point on B, you can also completely cut off access to the city and A. So it should definitely be a central focus of your strategy to either deny the enemy this hill or either try to take it yourself. Now, this also brings up a bit of a side note. While both sides can effectively use this hill just immediately south of B to dominate large sections of the map, the south spawn does have a slightly better position on the immediate right-hand side of the hill in this little cutout. You can get great vision using the third-person camera to see enemies, pop up, take a shot, and pop back. And the beauty of it is you don't really need that much gun depression to use it effectively, so most vehicles can use this position. That being said, if you do have a particularly small turret or some of the missile tank destroyers, you can use it a lot better than others. The big thing here is simply getting the range, because on average your shots will be pretty far away. Now, this leads into a neat little segue because Maginot is one of the few maps wherein you actually have a counter to the power position, and what I mean by that is if you are in the north spawn and you go to the left-hand side around the fort, you can get to the part of the map that I have on the footage in the background. Now, as you can clearly see, I am able to both see and hit targets that are on the hill in the middle of the map and successfully counter them. And this is one spot that very few people seem to know about or be aware of. This means that more often than not, you will get the first shot, and if you get the first shot, you can easily eliminate the enemy as long as you have the range. And wouldn't you know it, this is very convenient because I actually have the range on screen because I have a laser rangefinder. The first range, and probably one of the longer shots you'll have to take here, is 928 meters, and the second and noticeably closer shot is 723 meters, so average it out to ballpark around 800 plus or minus for this position. Now, one position that you absolutely have to be aware of if you are from the north spawn is actually this camping position right here that can see all the way into and across everybody leaving your spawn. And this is another reason why I usually like to, from the north spawn, go to the left hand side. Not only can I pick people off from that middle hill, but also I can shut down this potential flank before it ever happens. This position is a serious problem for your team because not only can the enemy shoot you and detect you out of spawn, but it also presents an opportunity for the enemy to simply drive around the fort and come in behind your team, which is honestly just as bad in many cases. Now, one thing I would also like to note about a lot of the power positions, especially if you're on the right hand side of the map around C is that yes, there is a lot of visibility and there's a lot of open space, but I feel like most players significantly underestimate how easy it is to basically get under the guns of the people on these power positions. If they want to shoot down at a really steep angle, often this requires cresting all the way over the ridge, which it can only really be done if nobody on your team is shooting at them. So there is merit to the idea of taking a particularly fast vehicle and essentially hugging the hill that your opponents would theoretically be using as a power position and using it as a power position yourself. This also bleeds into one of the more peculiar aspects of Maginot, which, as I mentioned earlier, the single cap maps are all slightly larger than the other maps, and this opens up the entire ridgeline on the right hand side. If you're doing single cap B and single cap C, this is especially problematic as this ridgeline can see both B and C. Even single cap A, both of the spawns are exposed to this ridgeline, so I would highly consider, even though it is a long way away from some of these objectives, considering going up to this ridgeline at the very least to try to stop your opponent from occupying it. Another position that is highly variable and somewhat trolly depending on which map side you're on is the river down here. The river can easily see into and spawn camp the south spawn pretty easily and can also cover a lot of the areas around the B hill. So one thing you do want to keep an eye on if you are in the south spawn and if you are on a map size where this is a usable piece of terrain is exactly what the opponent is doing down here, because this can result in your team getting shot in the flank pretty efficiently, and especially if you're at the higher battle ratings where things like laser range fighters are commonplace and those are easy shots to hit, it could be a very significant problem for your team. Speaking of unusual positions, the hill immediately behind the north spawn point actually does provide excellent vision, although it can be a very exposed position. That being said, while it is a pretty exposed position, there is a bit of a draw on it, so you can use that as a degree of cover. So in general, it is at least worth considering potentially adopting that as an overwatch position. Now, this leads into the section where we talk about how I generally like to play Maginot, and the interesting thing about Maginot is I go to very different spots depending on the type of vehicle I have. If I have a very long-range sniper type vehicle that isn't terribly mobile, or even if it has mobility, if it has a very small turret that makes it hard to hit, I usually favor the right-hand side of the map to an extent. It has nice open sight lines and a lot of areas where you can really let your long-range firepower come to bear. On the other hand, if I have a very brawly vehicle, I usually favor the right-hand side map and specifically the city. There's a lot of places where you can get stuck in and be at close quarters with the enemy and brawl it out with them, and you can really make your armor a major factor in those fights. For vehicles that are flanking sniper types, I usually like to wrap around the right-hand side of the map because it provides excellent vision and there's a lot of nice open ground that you can use, especially if you have something like a wheeled vehicle. And of course, for more versatile brawly type vehicles, I find the area around B is usually the best because B provides opportunities for close, mid, and long-range fights, so if your vehicle has the versatility to pull it off, B can be an excellent position. On the whole, I find almost regardless of what type of vehicle you are in, Maginot does provide at least that playstyle in some parts of the map. So being aware of this can allow you to basically be really effective on Maginot as long as you're willing to learn how all of the parts of the map play out. With that being said, however, I will wrap back around to what I said earlier. The hill immediately south of B is an absolutely dominant position and it is very difficult to win while your opponent controls it. So while there are a bunch of positions you can occupy, you should always keep an eye on your team and the enemy team around the hill south of B, because if the enemy controls that for too much of the map, your team can eventually start getting spawn stuffed and having their movement avenues heavily limited. And giving some of my overall thoughts on Maginot, and going back and reviewing it gave me a pretty good concept for how much I don't actually dislike the map at all. In fact, I actually think Maginot is probably the best designed bad map in the game. Maginot actually flows pretty well, and even though it does have some pretty egregious spawn camping areas, it also has a lot of different parts of the map for various different types of vehicles to play, which is something most maps in War Thunder don't pull off terrifically well. On top of that, while some of the big maps, and especially the huge maps, can be a bit of a driving simulator, the much more concise and compact design of small Maginot does make it actually have a pretty good game flow. on the whole, I would say I don't dislike the map at all. I think it's actually on the better end, and I don't really dislike seeing it in the matchmaker. I usually enjoy seeing it come up, and I've had a lot of good games in it. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of Maginot Line. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. If you like the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.